Welcome, students, teachers, and the generally curious to the 16th episode of the winter-spring season of the Constitution. What Constitution? In today's program, we will address the question of voting, its foundation as a right under the American political system, and whether or not the law requires equal access to voting. Since we are coming to the end of our 9th season, I thought I would do my fellow FOPs a favor and present my final rant regarding the demise of American constitutional government. So students, teachers, alum, and the generally curious, I raise the white flag. I surrender. American democracy is on life support, and I can find no remedy to the diseases that plague us. We not only have lost the battle for our constitutional soul, we are also about to surrender to number 47's version of a Chinese cultural revolution. History is being erased on a daily basis as the Pentagon and military establishment, in response to presidential orders, have been erasing articles addressing stories about Navajo code talkers, African American service members, and women Air Force service pilots from their websites. University presidents are on their knees begging for mercy and sacrificing any academic integrity that still exists as they close out programs that might offend the felon-in-chief. Traditional media has been threatened and coerced to temper its coverage of the administration, and the AP has been banned from the White House press corps. Science and scientists are being defunded and silenced, endangering public health and America's lead in scientific development. And finally, there is no opposition party to speak of as the leader of the Senate Democrats put down his political sword and caved to the whims and passions of America's dictator. Rule of law has taken its final breath as the administration has consistently ignored the judicial branch twice just in this past week. Finally, the framers hope that Congress as a whole would provide the counter ambition to check the power of the executive, reveal that they are more concerned with keeping their jobs than doing their job. So I give in and give up. So for the remaining episodes, I will pretend that our discussions have meaning, that this material is important. It is important, but only as a reminder of the failed experiment of self-government and rule of law that was put into motion nearly 249 years ago, when a generation of Americans argued that a government of the people, by the people, for the people was possible and shall not perish. So it is now time, I'm done with my final rant, hopefully of my life. So yeah, that's precedent. So it is now time to ask the bad members what they think about this day in history in 1765, as the British Parliament repealed the Stamp Act of 1765. Is this a need to know, nice to know, or nuts to know event in history? Professor Williams.
Well, that's not fair.
Of course it is. I know, that's why I did it. You're a Giant fan.
Yeah, I don't have all this stuff memorized like Tim and Chris does. Yeah, it's a need to know, because my recollection is on the same day they repealed the Stamp Act, they passed the Declaratory Act. And so, if anything, you need to know the date for those two things happening together. They could not get out of their own way, that British Parliament in 1765.
See, I'm impressed. You have learned something in our time together. There's no way you would have known about the Declaratory Act, except Professor Morse mentioned it about 17 times in our sessions together.
It is very, very true.
So well done there. Professor Kavanaugh.
Wigs.
Help me out with that. Help our audience out.
Well, we have a little, every time Tim mentions the Whig Party or Western Pennsylvania politics, I take a swig of my tea, right? Maybe appropriate for this topic. I'm gonna go with needs to know as well, but I think, David, maybe this is for you and for me too, because I'm not too far distant from your rant. Think of the power of the people on this side of the Atlantic to get the Crown to change position on the Stamp Act, right? Enough people came together, enough protests, enough angry voices were heard, and the Crown and Parliament relented. So I'm saying there's a chance. So yes, it's a needs to know.
I'd push back on that, but it's not the time. It's not the time here. Professor Moore, the
Need to
man
know.
who's the Stamp Act Congress, he doesn't memorize this stuff, Mike. It runs through his veins. It's part of his DNA.
Yes. Yes, it is. Um, I say it's need to know for a couple of reasons. It's
I'm shocked. I'm shocked.
because the whole thing in 65, 66, 67, I think if I was ever to go back in the classroom, ooh, um, I think this is I would do a lot more case study type approaches to teaching. And I think this is a great case study in cat and mouse games. I think it's also a case study of equal and opposite reaction. I mean, there's a lot of ways to frame the Stamp Act crisis. One of the great books on it is one of her first books was Pauline Mayer. It was really fantastic. But the case is like, all right, the immediate case is it appropriate to keep sending petitions that we don't like these laws? Or do we use civil unrest? And in some cases, is it appropriate? We've talked about this before. Is it appropriate to use violence? So I think the response, the act and the response to the act, as well as the declaratory act, but even you don't even have to get to the declaratory act, really. It's a great case study in what is appropriate in terms of citizen, in that case, subject response to injustice. So I think I would definitely put it in that category because I think it's a great case study.
Well, if with what Mike said, if you add the declaratory act into this discussion, then I'll go, it is a need to know. Because in the end, I think it's kabuki theater what happened here. And then is okay, yeah, we'll give up the Stamp Act, but we declare our power. And in the last analysis, where does it end up? That is
the Townsend Revenue Act, which is essentially
no, I'm talking about
Part 2.
where's it? What's the ultimate end? The ultimate end is that the Parliament doesn't back down. All right, we end up in a military conflict. So it's a warm fuzzy moment. Yay, we were able to get them, but they follow it right up with. And don't get your hopes up here too much. You colonists here, we still have this authority, and you're going to have to deal with it. Yeah. So. But that's why it would be a good discussion or a good case study in class there. So thank you for sharing your insights there, friends. And so it's now time to turn to our discussion. Yeah.
David, I'm sorry, before we push on, I did something that I normally don't do, and I watched one of our old episodes on citizenship. And Tim's comment just now is really a great segue. And for the people watching this show, I know we're going to be doing a Unit 3, but tell your Unit 6 mates. I'm going to drop a little kernel here. And this was from the Declaration of Independence. And they went back and examined Jefferson's original draft, and through a process called electoral spectral analysis, which is they looked at the ink, the different inks that he used. And one of his grievances, which was he has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country. Originally, he had written the word subject, and they were able to examine that and realize that he had crossed out that word subject and wrote in the word citizen. And since our episode, our program on the very, very long quote from Frederick Douglass on citizenship. So I think for the students, if again, Unit 3 folks watching this, share this with your Unit 6 mates, that's an interesting thing to think about. Here we are in the Declaration that we are citizens, not subjects. So what it's worth.
You got anything from Lafayette to share?
No, not yet. Not yet. I'm working on that though.
Okay. We got 50 minutes left here. So hopefully we can throw some Lafayette at him. So let's turn to our discussion topic with the dealing with the expansion of voting rights and the connective tissue between voting and upholding American Fundamental American Principles. We will begin our discussion with the man who once told me that Dolly Madison would be considered the pinup girl of the 18th century, kind of like a Sports Illustrated swimsuit model, and that all the other founders, framers were befuddled as to how little Jimmy Madison was able to wed the belle of the ball, Professor Tim Moore. So, Tim, you have your own befuddled look on your face there. Am I wrong?
Yeah, I don't know. I always kind of thought what went on at Montpelier stayed at Montpelier, but I guess not. So
Well,
Madison definitely outkicked his coverage.
yeah.
well, I thought what happened in Mount Montpelier was Mr. Horvath from the great state of Indiana, and
Yeah.
his exclamation during the reading of
Yeah.
love poetry.
Yeah,
Um,
that was remarkable as well. Yeah.
yes, yes. Tim, I did a quick Google search, and I discovered much ambiguity over the question of whether voting is a fundamental right. First, what is meant by a fundamental right versus all other rights? And secondly, just looking at the Constitution of 1787, how do you address this question on the fundamental nature of voting rights?
Wow. The
Yeah.
what is a fundamental right? I guess my first bite at this apple is it kind of depends where you are on a timeline. Like, for example, if you would ask the question, what is a fundamental right in the colonial era? The answer would be, well, look at the common law. Um, maybe look at our charters. Places like Massachusetts went well beyond the common law and started articulating other rights. Um, there's a time and place question here. What's fundamental right? You go to the Revolutionary era, you'd say, well, what's fundamental right? Well, I think a lot of people would say, look at our new constitutions where we've created bills of rights, and then do a comparative study. How much appears in Pennsylvania, which also appears in, you do a little comparison. If you're in the constitutional era, I think the question is answered by, well, you kind of look at privilege and immunities in the articles. You may look at the Northwest Ordinance where you've got religion. You've got a trial by jury. There's due process that appears in the Northwest Ordinance. If you look at the Constitution itself, you go to the constitutional era. In the body of the Constitution, you have the habeas corpus, you have statements about ex post facto, bills of attainder. I think, and then you go, okay, so if you ask Madison when he's collecting these 212 suggestions from the state ratifying conventions, and he winnows all those 212 down to, 17 statements, he'd say, well, those are the fundamental rights. And then the Senate would say, oh, yeah, maybe not. We're going to give you 12. And then after all of that, you start looking at the court. How is the court define fundamental rights? And that's especially problematic when you deal with like incorporation, because they had the original fight is total incorporation or selective. Now, selective, which ones do we incorporate first? Well, and Chris can correct me if I'm wrong on this. I think it boiled down to which ones should we incorporate first? Well, let's figure out which one the fundamental rights. And I think that was a theory for a while in the 20th century. So I think the answer is when and where you are on a timeline as to how you would define a fundamental right.
Well, in this rights discussion, I guess one of the things I maybe want students to think about by labeling something, by putting rights in categories.
Mm-hmm.
All right, are we implying that there is different treatment of those rights depending on what category they're in? So if they're in this category fundamental rights, they would have the highest level of protection versus something that would just be called a political right.
Yeah, that's a great wow, that's a great follow-up. I'm not sure. I may have to tap out on this, but I'll take a whack at this. I think it may Ask it again. My mind's racing 1,000
Well,
miles an hour.
again, and I think the text does it at some point. I know that civics teachers do, is we talk about the
Mm,
different categories of rights. There's economic rights, there's
yeah,
political rights, there's human rights. These terms, these categories, are
yeah,
they implying that there would be different treatment of the right depending on what
yeah,
category they're in, i.e., fundamental would have the
yeah,
highest level of protection versus an economic right may not have the same level of protection.
yeah. I think. Well, I think at a conceptual level, it's ridiculous to put that hierarchy because um, if you want to say rights are rights are rights, and you start making balls and strike calls, then you're really opening yourself up to all kinds of, I think, certainly if you're a judge, interpretive nightmares in kind of creating the hierarchies. But on a theoretical level, I would say, all rights. Chris has said this over and over again, and I agree with him that all not rights are not absolute. There's automatically caveats to how far a right can extend. So does that deprive them of their specialness if all rights are have a context in which they can operate? So I think from the get-go, where you have a problem if you define rights as absolute. And then I think it is balls and strike calls, and that's the great American constitutional history debate that we have. Did the court get that right? You know, in addressing the absolute or non-absolute nature of rights.
Well, Chris and Mike, I want you to jump on this, but let me ask it this way. My understanding is post 1930s, as we start to emerge into the rights revolution, there's this notion of strict scrutiny and compelling interest. All right, and so some rights government has a higher bar. All right, that they have to clear in order to limit that right than other rights. And is that an accurate understanding of kind of jurisprudence, adjudication of rights? And that's where this other question I asked Tim, that's where it emanates from.
Yeah, that's the idea of strict mid-tier and reasonableness test. I mean, it comes in, it's a very 20th century concept. I would direct students to take a look at Palco v. Connecticut, where the court comes up with its two-prong test to determine the fundamentalness of a right. Is it necessary for a scheme of order, liberty, and is it a long-held tradition? But listening to your and Tim's discussion, very theoretical, very interesting, in such a short period of time, it makes me think about one of the fears Madison had about writing. Once we start to write this stuff down, what if we forget something? Does that mean you don't have that right? And of course, the safety net that is the Ninth Amendment that has allowed the court to find rights, so to speak, in a modern sense. And which is where's the right to, we have this discussion, where's the right to privacy? Do you have a right to privacy? If so, can you point to it in the Constitution? And we know we joke about penumbras and emanations, but it's a very interesting idea. But maybe I'll defer to the political scientist who's good at putting things in categories or buckets.
Well, I'm just going to quote Lafayette on this because he actually
well done.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great question, and it's a great thing for the students to be thinking about. We overuse the term right, I think, is part of the issue. So, for example, we use it so much like, oh, I have a right to open my business, or I have a right to education. In both cases, the court would say, if we call it a right, it's going to be a rational basis test. For me, it's a necessary versus sufficient question. It's like, is there a right? A right is something that is necessary for self-governance to occur, to go on. So, First Amendment, free speech, to me would be something that could be fundamental. Since we don't lay it out, and since we kind of walked into the trap that Madison said we were going to walk into by writing some down, we get into these questions about what to do with this language. Some constitutions, like South Africa, like they have a section called fundamental rights, and their constitution says we cannot change these. Like, you can never amend these. They're veto proof, right? They're bulletproof. everything else is just not going to be even considered a right. That's one way that some countries have done it, like South Africa. We haven't done it that way, which means every generation can debate over what a right is, and then have that next debate over fundamental, and we just kind of go around in circles.
So, Professor Kavanaugh, assuming that voting is not and was not a fundamental right in the first 90 years of our constitutional history, have the numerous amendments 14, 15, 19, 23, 24, 26 now established voting as fundamental?
Um, I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say yes. I think the access to the polls, the access to voting, to have a say, because we are a federal democratic republic. When you want to describe our government, layers of government, our federalism, national, state, local. People get to vote, and Madison wrote about this. I mean, the idea of that voting was going on in the colonies, and then voting is going on in the states, and obviously electing our representatives. And I think, yeah, it should. I think voting is a fundamental right. I mean, think about the ordeals, and you think about the 14th Amendment, voting rights in the 14th Amendment, Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. Not only the voting rights in Section 2, but also the due process and equal protection of the laws and citizenship in Section 1. 15th Amendment, we know the states are going to work their way around the 15th Amendment because of Jim Crow laws. The idea you're not being prohibited to vote based on your skin color, but did your grandfather vote? Or can you tell me how many bubbles in a bar of soap with literacy tests? You think of the 19th Amendment, the struggle to get women the right to vote in national elections, the 23rd Amendment, right? The idea of people in Washington, D.C. having some representation, which of course they would still argue they don't have enough representation. I mean, their license plates still say taxation without representation. The 24th Amendment, the idea that people shouldn't have to pay a poll tax, the last vestiges of Jim Crow finally struck out following that. And then, of course, the 26th Amendment in 1971, 18-year-olds the right to vote, old enough to die, old enough to vote, as in a backdrop of the Vietnam War. So I think through all of these struggles, I just believe, and I don't really have a great legal theory or political theory to hang my hat on, but I just think the struggles of expanding the franchise to more and more people, there has to be a level of fundamental right.
But does it matter that all of these amendments, the language is framed in negative constitutionalism? And it seems to me that in order for it to be fundamental, we need positive we need positive language.
I absolutely agree, David. I mean, because which speaks, for the students examining this, you're probably already aware, but David's point is really on point here. The idea that we don't come out and say you have a positive right to vote. You're 18 years old, you're registered, you have an ID now, or whatever some states require, because obviously, states are still in charge of running their elections for the most part. But no state can abridge your right to vote if you're 18, have an ID. We should just say that, but we don't, because we're still allowing people to control the franchise and limit the idea of suffrage, which makes students, hopefully, you're asking the question, why? Why have people been so restrictive or so controlling in expanding the right to vote?
Well, I think to your point in previous episodes, Chris, I mean, America's always struggled. So much of voting has to do with gender and race. And that's, I think, heavily influences our sensitivity about its fundamentalness. But I'm still willing to suggest, I mean, I think the trajectory of all of these amendments, David, moves it pretty dang close to being a fundamental right. But I still have to believe the creative lawyers out there can carve out, yeah, but what about the 7-year-old? I mean, that's low hanging fruit. So I think the trajectory is, I think, in Chris's zone, in Chris's logic there, but I'm unwilling to make it fundamental, because I think there are some exceptions that may be reasonable.
Yeah. I mean, I think Chris's points are are well stated. I wish it were fundamental. I think it's more fundamental than it is now than it was 200 years ago.
Oh
But
yeah.
to your point, again, other constitutions in the world it's a one sentence provision. The right to vote exists, right? And from that flows all these other things. Like, okay, now it's going to be a national holiday when we vote. Why? Because if the right to vote exists, it means you can't use the excuse that you have to go to work, so you know to not vote. It means if you're in prison, you vote. You know, all those types of things. I know we're going to talk about. So the fact that it hasn't been framed like that just leaves it up to these darn lawyers who are just going to carve it up.
What's so frustrating in a way too, if you think over, not in the recent decades, the Supreme Court has even affirmed that voting is a fundamental right, deserving of, because they've allowed heightened scrutiny. Oh my gosh, heightened scrutiny when they're looking at these issues, right? Except for, of course, Shelby County, which I'm sure will come up in a discussion in a bit. So, which is kind of like backtracking or to steal from Justice Ginsburg in her dissent. It's like putting away your umbrella or throwing away your umbrella simply because it's not raining right now. So I do think if you look at the case law, that certainly has elevated the voting to a fundamental right for the most part.
So, Professor Williams, I'm wondering, and I'll be honest, I chuckled when I first read the question, but I'm wondering how you understand the statement, the right to vote connects citizens to their government. As we're well aware, I'm in somewhat of a dour, dark, cloudy mood these days and don't feel really warm and fuzzy about the American constitutional system. So beyond theoretical, does it really do that? All right. And if it does do that, how do we account for the fact that a majority of Americans don't participate? Are
Yeah,
we saying that a majority of Americans don't have a connection to their government?
yeah.
Kind of play
It's a
around with that.
no, it's a really good observation to kind of dig deep into that what that phrase means. So let me start. I think it might provide a connection in a society of which a mass group of people have never had that ability. So, for example, I'm thinking about South Africa in 1994. I'm thinking about people waiting in lines for half the day, right? To to for the opportunity to vote for a government because they had never, if you're a Black South African, never had that opportunity. And you talk to folks who did that, and they felt a connection for the first time to those who would then be holding, making power and laws over them. I think in that kind of context, I think it might. Now, in the political science research, the way we get at this is we ask questions about what's the relationship between voting and political trust, or voting and political efficacy, which is a phrase that means, do you believe that you have an ability to have an effect on the political system? And to be honest, that research is super, super mixed. It's hard to do this research, but it's nuanced and it's mixed. So the evidence is mixed, and I think as I was just thinking about this, not as a political scientist, but just about just as a person in my community, I think a lot of folks feel like it doesn't connect them to the government these days. They don't feel like that their vote matters. Like it doesn't feel like it makes a difference if you're voting in a presidential election in California in 2024. And if you're a Republican, it probably doesn't matter the way we count up electoral votes, right? Um, we've talked about in earlier episodes how big our congressional districts are. So even if it would matter in a congressional race, do you ever get an opportunity to actually sit down and talk to your representative? So that, I think in the lived experience, that connection isn't felt. Um, I would have students think about challenging that idea of the right to vote about connection and the right to vote about exercising power over the government. And it is one way, it is the easiest way, it is probably the least effective way to exercise government. I mean, we always tell our students, and I'm sure all of you did as well, the very least you can do as a citizen is go vote on election day. The very least, right? It's all these other things you can do: petition, the things we were talking about with the Stamp Act, civil disobedience, protesting, boycotting. Those are the things that are not really connecting you to. I mean, the government is us. The government is not this separate thing. It's exercising our power over it. And voting does provide that opportunity. But to your point, David, half of us in most elections don't use that opportunity, and fewer of us use the opportunities to petition government and to boycott and do the other things. So there's something deeper going on here in our culture about our ability to exercise power over the government.
Tim?
I, for one, am quite fascinated by these town hall meetings that are going on right now. And we've had a few in my area. And I'm fascinated by what Mike said about this question about connecting to government. I'm just our town hall meetings and the hollering that goes on, is that as effective in terms of connecting to government as going to a voting booth? I'm willing to suggest that those town hall meetings, as ugly as they can get, and some of them have been, are just as important way to connect to government as pulling a lever. So I'm quite fascinated by the rattle and hum going on
And
in towns all over.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because watching some highlights of some of those town hall and then reading, you know, first of all, you know that one of the major parties has instructed their members not to hold town hall
Right,
meetings. All
right.
right. But most importantly, from a couple of those, it made me wonder, does a representative have the duty to represent everybody in their political community? Because a number of these people, starting from the president on down, is that this agitation, this anger, that's
Yeah.
from Democrats. And my thing is, yeah, but they're still
Well,
members of your political community.
yeah.
So I'm wondering about, if voting connects us, doesn't it say that the representative has a responsibility to represent everybody? Because these town hall meetings, Professor Moore, the communication I'm getting is, no, I only represent those people who voted for me.
Well, we'll find that out. I mean, I think the Democrats are hoping in the midterms will kind of refute the premise of your question there. But I mean, there's all kinds of way we can connect to government. Voting's one, and hollering at representatives at town hall meetings, and marching up and down Pennsylvania Avenue, or in our case, we've got some stuff going on in our little town, our little Lake Wobegon here in Wisconsin at a local level, where there's some city council members and like school board members that are out walking around the neighborhoods, and they're getting earfuls. So I think there's a local component to this too, but I'm quite fascinated by the citizen input that's going on in these town hall meetings.
Chris and Mike, do you guys understand what I'm saying here
Yeah,
about?
I'm not. I've heard people trying to explain that away that way, but I'm not sure that what I've seen have been people that are, you know, I don't know that they're all the opposite party. I think there are people that are just frustrated now because of what's happening, and so I think
Yeah.
I think there's just a general level of frustration, and I've seen it actually. I try and make it a habit of reading the Bismarck Tribune, and I try to have it up on the board as my first period class is coming in, because I'm trying to subliminally, get them to follow local news because it's important. And on our local editorial page, as one might imagine, in Bismarck, North Dakota, is pretty, is fairly to the right. But the letters that have been coming in as the past couple of weeks, maybe more than that, have had I've been surprised with their stances. So the idea of connecting another way, of maybe an old school way, but that's me, is writing a letter to the editor and having it published, in the paper. So I've seen that as well. So I'm not sure that all those folks that are ranting, and certainly some of them have, been pretty vocal at these town halls. I don't know that they're all members of the opposite party. I think there's just a level of frustration.
Yeah, no, two quick points on this. I mean, the language, David, you're right, is fascinating. And what I've heard is this broader category of outside agitators, and then filling in Democrat, which is fascinating, right? Because we all know that goes back to the revolutionary period, right? That goes back to about calls for against slavery, and during Reconstruction, it's always these outsiders, right, who are causing up trouble in the community. And nowadays, it's the Democrats. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I would have the students look for, if you're in a if it's a Republican district and the Republican member of Congress is up and there's Democrats there, whatever, yeah, he may say, okay, yeah, maybe you're part of the community, but you lost the vote. Sorry, right? What's more interesting is to think about is is the Democratic Party going to go through what the Republican Party went through 15 years ago, right? I mean, students, the Republican Party that exists today started with the Tea Party movement in 2010, and it happened in town hall meetings that Dave is talking about. To me, it's going to be fascinating to watch to see what are the Democrats doing. I mean, in terms of them getting pressure from their own constituents about how they should be responding to Trump's policies. That is where I think, to Tim's point, more than the next election, that's how citizens can exercise power today, especially if you're a Democrat. I think there's an opportunity there.
I find it fascinating. Our local member of Congress, more recently it was Kevin McCarthy, and now it's Vince Fung. We haven't had a traditional town hall meeting for over 10 years. They're done by Zoom or phone, in which the member of Congress can therefore have tremendous control, and you don't have this kind of thing. And it also it reminded me that although all political systems have flaws, of my love affair with the parliamentary system. In the English Parliament, members of Parliament, they got to go back to their districts, and they do this monthly. They go to a church or a schoolhouse, and they sit there, and people line up to talk to their member of Parliament, on a monthly basis. And I thought that was the whole purpose for the so-called Republican Revolution, of going back to your district and not staying in DC, and don't become too much inside the Beltway, and so keep going back to your district. But like I said, in my district, unless you're a well-paying member of the Republican Party, you really don't have much access, other than to talk to staff members. Yep.
In Wisconsin, our recently redrawn maps, in my estimation, have helped in Wisconsin, because we've kind of been front and center on the most heavily gerrymandered. Like it's like the Academy Awards of who has the most gerrymandered state. Wisconsin always is on the nominated. But the redistricting has helped us, and I think there's a lot more. People are. I guess if I'm a heavily gerrymandered district, I don't have to go home. But I think in Wisconsin, I think the maps have helped create this dynamic of, hey, there are people in my formerly safe district that it's no longer safe, and they're going to be hollering at me. So I have some optimism about that, at least here in Wisconsin. Yeah.
Chris?
I do want to just emphasize, Dave, that I really appreciate the fact that you brought out the question in terms of connectivity to their government, and for the students, which government, right? Is it your school board? Is it your town council? Is it your mayor's office? Is it your state rep or state senator? So when you're approaching this question, I granted in your 4-minute response, good luck with that. But for follow-up, understand when it says your government, and that connectivity, that connective tissue, and especially for students that may not be of voting age, right? What connective tissue do you have to your governments, plural?
Yeah.
And maybe even define what government you're going to answer.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
So kind of coming full circle, Professor Moore, as we were talking about voting as a fundamental right, I would argue here that in the year 2025, we are in no better of a situation when it comes to voting than we were in 1965, because state governments still have the bulk of control over elections and over the voting process. They have predominant authority over voting access and laws. Tell me why I'm either right or wrong about that. Are we better off today than we were in 1965, or is it pretty much we're at the same place?
Well, first of all, I have to say this question really has been a thorn in my side for about a week now.
Oh, good.
This is like a political science question, David. I had to look at studies and research. I had to look at data and percentages. It's like unbelievable. I always felt like calling, Mike, help me, I'm drowning here. So here, so kids, students,
First two questions were in the history realm, all right? But we got to go into the political science realm. Sorry.
yeah, but well, anyway,
What are your thoughts?
it's interesting to me that as I looked at endless number of research studies, I had to almost get good and liquored up every time. But it seems to me, I mean, I was looking like, because I put in from 65 to now kind of, in the search parameters. And it was amazing to me that it seems like 60% for presidential, well, until I think 2020, it went up towards 70, which was like astronomically high for America. But it seems to me since 65 on, we've always hovered around in presidential years, we've always hovered around 60, give or take. Midterms, we always hover around 37, 40%. So there doesn't seem to be, unless there are some caveats. Young folks in this after the passage of the 26th Amendment spiked in turnout. But then later in the 70s, it started to decline. Got to the 90s, and like I don't think there was any 18 to 24-year-olds voting. It was so low. The old folks, they've always maintained, but it's they're the high. But the conglomerate it's always been around 60-ish. So I guess my observation is okay. We have a higher population, but the percentage kind of seems to stay there. So I guess my philosophical question is, does it matter if we're stuck around 60% since 65? It seems to be that's always there. So the better question is, and I think this is where Mike can hopefully weigh in, and I'm going to tap out. What is it that we can't raise that percentage of turnout? There's a lot of theories that there's disillusionment that suppresses turnout. There's apathy. It means all these different studies, and they are all over the place on the internet. So I don't know. I've also found it interesting in the last 10 years, there are 10 states that have had ballot restriction policies, and there's like a dozen that have actually expanded the right to vote. And so, I find that, I think if you're predisposed to think of this a certain way, I found that interesting. Now, I don't know how that overall impacts the overall numbers in terms of turnout percentages and whatever, but I guess I challenge your phrasing "no better off."
Well, first of all, we got to remember that the numbers you're using, 60% or whatever, is of those who are registered.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm curious, I mean, again, what percentage of the American adult population who can vote are registered to vote? And has that changed drastically over time? Now, some states make it automatic, so that may skew it. There you go, get a driver's license, you're automatically registered or stuff like that. And to my question is, I guess the real point of my question is, does sharing power between the state and national government inhibit, all right, access and participation in voting, given that we give states a preponderance of the authority?
Well, I think some states, clearly the answer is some states yes and some states no. So I don't know. I'm going to defer to Mike on that question. He's probably got more insight to address that than I would.
Well, okay. It's changed among certain groups, of course, right? I mean, so after 1965 with the Voting Rights Act, where the federal government took on a larger role, we definitely saw the numbers of African Americans go up, right? Because state governments had enacted laws to stop that from happening. And then way up and way down, and now with Shelby County, as Chris has mentioned, it's now it has gone back to state governments, and we have seen registration rates decline. To Tim's point, in the political science literature, there's a bunch of these studies that Tim loved reading about. Um, about
I
all.
needed to take a nap. I needed to take a nap, Mike.
I know, and it's all in 9-point font too. So you gotta work through that. Um, it's some of these structural barriers that many argue that if we could fix some of the structural barriers, or like the day that we have elections, or um, um, the ease of which there is to register, or even the competitiveness of an election, or those types of things would matter. Um, but David, to your point, it's registration numbers have gone down since Shelby, and that just shows that getting back to this point, is it fundamental or not? And are we on this roller coasters? Some generations it's more fundamental than others. I would say we're living through a generation that it's not as fundamental, just because the federal government, which has the power to enforce this uniformly across the states, after Shelby County, no longer is going to exercise that power like it was doing before.
Well, isn't it true that black voting registration actually went down, as Tim mentioned, in the 80s and 90s? I mean, there's this spike like young voters, but then especially the late 80s through the 90s,
Sure.
both youth and black voters
All
went
right.
down significantly in registration there. So
And Dave, and that connects, I'm sorry, that yes. And I think that connects to the question you're asking about connecting to the government. Because what's happened in the 1980s? There's changes in laws on which kinds of drugs are going to be, the war on drugs, and we have a whole generation of a lot of African men who are either going to prison or who are interacting with the justice system, and the research does show if you're in a group of people who you don't feel like the government is actually there, kind of in your corner, you're going to be less likely to register to vote or to vote. So I think all that kind of makes sense with what we would expect from people if they're going to be acting rationally.
So, Professor Kavanaugh, I heard a member of Congress say recently that uh, all we have to do to guarantee the equality of voting is to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2023. Do you agree that is the silver bullet? If we pass that law, we will have fixed and we will have guaranteed equality of access to voting.
Well, there are two different things you just mentioned there. Access and equality, right? I think we'll fix the access issue, but as his previous last 5 minutes have shown, the idea of equality of voting, that's entirely up to the people to take that on themselves. And it's interesting to think about too. We talk and Tim's love of reading studies now. How often, we talk about people and our voting turnout, which we know has been woeful, pretty bad, really. There have been spikes when it's been pretty good. If it's a fundamental right, but it's just like free speech is a fundamental right. How often does the average person go out and carry a sign walking down the street and protest or in support of something? We don't normally do that. Very few people until we actually get some big movement or some big protest plan. So it's interesting to equate those ideas of fundamental rights and how often we exercise them. But back to your question, David, I do think that the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2023 would fix a lot of access problems, because we saw this as soon as Shelby County, as soon as Shelby County came down, you had states who were enacting tougher laws and restricting access to the ballots, which disproportionately affected African Americans. And so, yeah, I mean, again, back to my point I made earlier, students ask that question, why? Why has this happened? And what you're going to find is people have talked about voter fraud, but we know that voter fraud doesn't really exist. Hell's bells, we can't get people to the polls, right? The idea that people are going to show up and cast illegal ballots, or some people that may be in the country without documentation may be casting a ballot. It would take thousands and thousands of people in a statewide election, millions in the nationwide election to sway things. So I think the John R. Lewis voting rights would definitely fix that, because it's going to turn around, and the same thing you mentioned earlier, David, that it's going to say, yeah, voting is you have a right to vote. It's going to say that.
Do you know what specific things are in that act? I'm sorry, I
it's going
read it, but
it's going to modernize some key protections. The Voting Rights Act of '65 is going to update some of those issues that came out of Shelby County. Right, it's going to propose some updating the formula for pre-clearance to determine which jurisdictions have a history. So it's going to go back and maybe take on some of the aftermath of Shelby County. But as I understand it too, it's actually going to say that you have a right to vote. But of course, it's getting pushback. It gets pushback because, we don't want the national government coming into our, this old anti-Fed argument. We don't want the national government coming in and telling us how to run our elections. We know what we do down here or around here, and we know what we like. So don't do this. Even back in the day when Mitch McConnell was still the Senate leader for the Republicans, he said it's unnecessary. That the current laws don't pose a threat to voter rights, and that existing protections are sufficient. But I was when I was.
So is that the essence of the Republican opposition to the John Lewis Act? It's a federalism issue? It's too much national government?
I think that's part of it. I think that's part of it.
Oh,
but
that's the old fig leaf of what caused the Civil War too. So I mean,
well,
the federalism was a race. So yeah, I mean, that argument's going on forever in our country.
Yeah, well, there's only one answer to that, and that was slavery. But the idea of this, and I found this article, gosh, back maybe towards the end of President Trump's first term. He said, we don't want, if we expand voting rights, we're not going to win another election. So I'll put a link to that article in the show notes. So that kind of like tells you right there, the cat's out of the bag.
So this is about raw political power. There's not a federalism thing.
It's definitely about raw political power. Definitely about raw political power.
And one of the problems with the federalism argument is that even without the national government, when there's reform movements in states to expand access and to reform, you get opposition, and I'm going to say predominantly by Republicans. All right, to reforming the state laws there. So I think, as you guys said, that the federalism argument's a little bit weak there.
Oh, absolutely. And there's another point. The part of the reason people don't show up, and you guys were alluding to this, and Mike was talking about it, but I would also address to younger people that disconnect, because when it's become harder and harder for young people to pay for college, or maybe to buy that first home, or when you're first starting out in society, and neither party seems to be addressing those issues that really would help, the 20 somethings that are just kind of starting out. Neither party seems to be, making it easier for them, or not necessarily easier, but addressing their real concerns. So you end up seeing this disconnect, right? The question asked about connection, but you start to see a disconnect because either party doesn't seem to be helping us. Same thing with Mike talking about African Americans in terms of the war on drugs and our penalties for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine.
Professor Williams, and I'm going to throw you a little bit of curveball, but I'm just wondering, before I have a kind of a more detailed question. Is this issue of access to voting, is it an international issue, a global issue, again, in constitutional democracies, representative form of governments, or is America once again an exception and an outlier here as far as how we do all this?
Yeah, we are an exception. I mean, we're also the longest. We have the oldest constitution, right? I mean, we've talked about this before. The founders had some limited vision about what a democratic republic would look like in the 1780s. And so you look at places throughout Europe and even throughout Africa who have rewritten their constitutions in mid 20th century. No, it's not an issue. In fact, in Europe, between the European Union and the individual nation states, people are voting all the time and encourage the voting all the time. And there is not this rivalry between the state and federal. In most places, most established democracies throughout the world, voting is a national or federal government issue. People are encouraged. There's holidays. They try to make it as easy as possible to get people to vote.
So the kids are asked to deal with, and I don't know how I feel about this question about are there any groups out there who currently cannot vote, who should be given the opportunity? And, I guess that's more of a policy question, which I feel a little bit uncomfortable with because each and every individual kind of has to weigh that on their own. But I guess the one group that I do wonder about, and I'm curious about your thoughts, and that is felons. Those who who are convicted of a felony, they've served their time, they're now out of prison. And I tried, I ran out of time. I tried to count how many states, which is the majority of states, they either can never vote or they've got to go through a pretty, complicated process to be able to get the right to vote. What are your thoughts about that? Do you think that's a legitimate interest of the state to heavily regulate felons? I know at one point there was a state, and I forget which one, they actually required felons, once they left prison, to register to vote, going back to that connectivity question that we had, because they wanted them to connect, all right, with the larger political community, feeling that that would be a way to hopefully keep them out of prison in the future. So I'm just wondering your thoughts.
Yeah, I forget which state that was as well. I mean, but students, I mean, this is the point we're talking about, right? This is where, depending on what state you're living in, the right to vote is going to be, or this fundamental right to vote is going to be applied differently, which it just begs the question, I think, about it being fundamental. So, I mean, how I feel about it, I've always had an issue with and not quite understood. Look, this is just for my own value system of fairness, and if you do a harm and if you pay the consequence for that harm, then you come back out in society, and you may walk around, people may stare at you and know you committed a harm, but you should exercise all the rights that everyone else has. So I've always had an issue with it. I was a bit surprised in my research on this. I'd forgotten what I learned from Kaiser's book on this. I mean, this has a long history in our republic. I mean, I think Kentucky in 1792, this was in their constitution that ex-felons, in Connecticut in 1818. By the Civil War, most states, three-quarters of the states had done it. After the Civil War, it pretty much becomes uniform, and and definitely in the South, and it's definitely a response to the end of slavery, and then using black codes and that whole thing. So, yeah, I would go even further. So yes, I do have a problem. Again, South Africa has been brought up a lot today. South Africa, you're in prison, you get the right to vote, and I've always thought that if there's a place in society where the government has the most control over you and that you should have some say over that power, it would be if you are in prison or within the criminal justice system. And the fact that I think there are two states, is that right? There are two states that allow you to vote. Three. Well, two states, Maine and Vermont and DC, allow incarcerated folks to vote. And then there's only 11 states by my count that allow you to get the right to vote back after you've served your time. All their states restrict it in some kind of way. I think it's fundamentally unfair. It goes against my value system, what I think the values of the US are on this issue. But I think it's another data point in your argument about whether the right to vote is fundamental or not.
Tim or Chris, any thoughts about that?
I guess I'd ask Mike, is there a hierarchy? Like some crimes you never get it back, other crimes might take you a little while, and other crimes you get it back right away?
I would say no. I mean, this is where Brian Stevenson, right, founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, has said we should never we should never be judged by our worst act. Like we're all human beings, and human being in a democratic republic, the most heinous crime, if you paid the price, if you paid the consequence, and now you're out in society paying taxes, following laws. No, I think, I don't see why we would deny. I mean, I can see why people would say we shouldn't deny it. I just don't buy it.
I think Florida is an interesting case study because Florida passed an amendment to restore voting rights to felons. And remember, students, these are people that have served their time. They went through due process, convicted of a felony, served the punishment. Now they're trying to incorporate back into society. So the state of Florida said, yeah, you know what? We should restore these voting rights. And then the state legislature of Florida said, well, wait a minute. Let's see. Can we make you take a test anymore? What about your grandfather? No, I got it. You have to pay all your fines that you had to pay prior, so you can't vote until you've completely wiped the slate clean. I think it's just another way to control voting at the state level to eliminate people that you don't want voting. And we know that even though African Americans make up 13% of the population, they make up a much higher percentage of people in prison. So it's another way to disenfranchise African Americans. So I think it's frustrating. I think a more staggering thing to think about would be, we've not even mentioned it, is Citizens United. I was just reading today that in Tim's state, they're going to have an election coming up in a couple of days for the state Supreme Court. And you have a person that's liberal and a person that's conservative running. And Elon Musk has pumped in over $10 million through his two of his political action committees to this election in the state. How does that play on voting rights in the state? And that doesn't restrict access, but we know that it provides certainly a much bigger megaphone for people, for a person that is an immigrant to this country, to then think about what he's doing. By the way, Tesla may have a case in front of that very same Supreme Court coming up. So we're going to allow this guy to drop over $10 million in a statewide election through his political action committee to control one seat on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. There's something, I know we talked about the word fundamentally, there's something fundamentally corrupt about that.
Yeah, but that's different than the vote. I mean,
Are there category? Yeah. Go ahead,
I mean,
Jim.
the election system, yeah, to your point, Chris, I agree. That's fundamentally flawed and corrupt. But I think I'd parse it out that it's not I don't say there's a clean connection there between the corruption of financing and the right to vote.
Well, I think absolutely there's a connection, Tim, in terms of if you can drop that amount of money into advertising, if you can drop that amount of money into TV time, if you can drop that amount of money into your platform that you own X, right? There's definitely a connection. Because
Well, I can just tell you anecdotally, my mailbox is full every day of like 5 or 6 from Schimmel and 5 or 6 flyers from Crawford. So I mean, and I'm in a very conservative county. So
right.
it seems like both camps have ample money to pollute my mailbox.
Well, I mean, I just read that, that piece about Musk today, so it's fresh. And I'm not saying that the Democrats don't do the same thing, but I do think there's absolutely a connectivity, especially when you talk about smaller elections, statewide elections. You go next door to my state in Montana when you have these out-of-state special interest groups drop a few $100,000 in a campaign. That's like a 1,000-pound gorilla coming in. That has a big power. That has a big influence on people that vote.
Yeah, and the thing most fascinating to, I guess, putting on our sanity hats is this is for a Supreme Court decision. I mean, it's a Supreme Court seat. All right, millions of dollars being dropped on an election for an officer that is supposed to have one job, and that's to interpret the law.
It's allegedly supposed to be nonpartisan.
And it's allegedly supposed to be nonpartisan. Yeah, and Wisconsin's not the only one. We went through this years ago in California with Rose Bird and the death penalty and stuff like that. So I feel your pain there, Professor Moore, kind of thing. So, gentlemen, we've come to the end of our time on this question. So it is your opportunity to provide final thoughts and recommendations to students and teachers on Unit 3, Question 2, dealing with voting rights. So, Professor Williams.
Well, I think, like I said, I think the state of Florida, I think, is a Yeah,
Oh, I wanted to go first because I got nothing to say.
Okay, go ahead, Professor Moore. You have nothing to say.
No, one thought. Students, I mean, I've been cracking wise about the studies, but I think you're gonna have to pony up and do some reading in these studies. I mean, I made fun of this, but some of the data is quite interesting. So my advice is you're gonna have to get into this. I mean, the Brennan Center's got some pretty cool stuff. Statistica, I think, is another interesting set of stuff. So you don't ignore this. Get out of the theoretical, and you're gonna have to do some of the studies. Yeah.
Professor Williams.
yeah. See, Tim, you had something really good to say right there. That was good. Look at you, a little political scientist.
I'm just throwing you a bone, man.
Ah, whatever. Um, well, as usual, students, I would say Dave has just provided some great questions that hopefully you will listen to them again and really think about them. Obviously, there seems to be a consensus on this panel that while theoretically we wish the right to vote was fundamental, it's not practically. Um, I would encourage you to not just take that as the capital T truth. Please don't take anything we say as capital T truth. Um, and
Oh, me.
maybe the way you should think, except for Tim, the way you should think about it is um, what can your generation do to make the right to vote more fundamental than it is? And use that as a way to get at these questions about structural issues or who has been left out and what are the reasons they have been left out, what are the arguments been made, and how you would like to see it, given David's dire message at the beginning that I too am in agreement with. It's going to be up to your generation to sort of like keep this thing going. So I would encourage you to think through how you could make it more fundamental.
Professor Kavanaugh?
Well, students, when you dive into those studies, please do not get liquored up. Okay. So let me put that out there first.
Yes,
so-
there. Yeah.
So do as he says, not as he does. Um,
It's a metaphor.
yeah, exactly. And I want to go back to David stressing this question about connectivity. So, and think of it, I want you to think of the connectivity as a two-way street. So what connects us to the government, but what connects our governments to us? You know, we've talked about voting because that seems to be the low-hanging fruit, right? And yes, David, you're right. The idea of, and I don't want do not, I mean, I brought that in here towards the end. Don't discount Citizens United and the role that money plays in governing. It plays an incredible role in governing, but there's also people power. I've seen it. I've seen it around the country. I've seen it in local levels. There is a way back to the very beginning of the Stamp Act. We talked at that at the very beginning of the show. Yes, David, I'm still holding on to that Pollyannish kind of feeling about trying to find a light in the darkness, baby. There's got to be a pony in the middle of all this horse crap. But students, think about the idea of this connectivity being a two-way street, because you are connected to your governments, plural. How are your governments connected to you? What do they do to connect you to them? It has to be a two-way street. So dive into the studies. That's good. But also what Mike said, how are you guys going to deal with it? You know, we're dumping this stuff on your lap. Our generation is dumping this stuff on your lap. How are you going to deal with it? So good luck. Tough question.
Yeah, I was going to add something, but I can't. There's nothing I can do to top. There's got to be a pony in the middle of this horse crap. That's just one of those Midwestern sayings. I don't know.
We got to get a Chris Kavanaugh T-shirt. Top
Yeah,
10.
that is it.
You guys have never heard that joke about the boy jumping into the room and digging around through that stuff, and he's all
I live a
excited?
very sheltered life, so no, it's all right. Again, that one makes me chuckle, and yeah, I want to get a shirt with that on there. That's great. There. So hopefully, students and teachers, we've helped you think about this question here. And there are very few things in my life that weekend dinners with the extended family, Dodger games, and a good round of golf that provide as much satisfaction as putting Professor Moore in the position of having to sound like a political scientist. That's one of the most satisfying things I can experience in life. In our next session, we'll be going to the strike zone of Mr. Moore here, and that's Unit 2. We'll be talking about the Articles of Confederation, and we look forward to that next session. Until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye. Bye, bonds.